a lot of you I know who are joining us as guests today. If I don't know you, I'm Chad Nikhazy. I'm Executive Vice President at Provisions Group. I oversee sales and account management. I'm also the beneficiary of getting to learn a lot of really neat stuff from our engineers and architects and Eric, our CTO. And so not long ago, we were having an internal discussion about UX, UI. And I was educated in a big way, right? There's a whole lot more to it than just the look and feel of what you see on the screen. And so that's what we're going to cover today, is UX and UI. It's a little, like I said, a little more complicated than what you see on the screen. If you don't know us, we at Provisions Group are a full-service IT consulting and staffing firm. I've been in business since 2003. We cover a few key areas, and so the things that we do internal, we have full-time engineers in our office in downtown Franklin who do application development, data and analytics, cloud, network, and security, and also Salesforce CRM. And I can't leave out DevOps. We do a lot of DevOps these days for folks. So that's what we do. Today we're here to go over Eric's topic on UX, and so I'll let him take it from here.
Thanks, Chad. I realized I didn't start my timer, so hold on, I'm going to put up my time so that I don't get too far afield when it comes to, if I don't have that thing going on in front of me, I'll lose track of where I am here. All right, well, come on now. All right, welcome everybody. I just quick audio check. Can everybody hear my voice, the sultry sound of my Tuesday voice? I was sick for 2 weeks. Not that y'all care to know this, but this has been the first week that I haven't felt like I was talking through a impending cough. So yay! I've graduated to mostly well, at least in the chest. I can't speak for the head. So anyway, so thank y'all for joining me today. What we're going to talk about today is passionate to me. If you all know me, you know that I get passionate about lots of different things. In fact, I almost get passionate about passion itself, because to be honest, it's an exciting world we live in, and certainly tech meets most of that excitement head on. But one of the areas in which I am very passionate about is UX, and the reason for that is because for two reasons. One, because I have seen it change organizations. I have seen it change engineering teams because of the value that it provides.
Eric, you suddenly muted there.
Yeah, you're on mute.
You were on a roll too.
Yeah, it was getting good. Still muted.
Somebody muted me. I didn't mute myself, and I see I'm on mute. Somebody muted me. That was awesome.
It was David D. George. He wasn't enjoying it as much as we were.
Come on, D. George. How you gonna mute me like that? No,
I'm on mute. My hands were not near anything. It wasn't me.
Well, I will tell you, I didn't mute me either. So I think somebody somewhere hit a button, but it wasn't me. So, but anyway, thank you all for telling me, because I might have been talking there for a little bit longer. So anyway, we frequently talk to organizations that have people who have that title, who have the title of UX designer or engineer or analyst, and so in some cases that means that they've decided to invest in UX, and in some cases it means that they think they're doing UX, and as it happens, they're doing either a subset, a sliver, or maybe not even UX at all. And so part of what I get the opportunity to do on a regular basis is help organizations think about number one, the value of UX. Number two, what engineering teams need from UX. It's ironic. We provide UX as a service at Provisions Group, and so while we offer that service, it's kind of funny because UX is often, especially UX done right, is often a product function. It's more something that lives underneath the chief product officer. More often than not, it lives less and less frequently underneath the engineering teams, and so. That said, engineering can't do good engineering without good UX. And so thinking about what UX is sort of what we're going to do today. By the way, if you've never been with us on one of these town hall style webinars, you don't know this, so I'll say this. I would appreciate being interrupted. I would appreciate questions. I would appreciate a quick amen, right? I mean, if you guys hear me say something and you just want to sort of explain how this works at your organization or things you've seen similarly that work well, please feel free to interrupt me. I have the other thing you might know about me if you've ever been on one of these is I have about 3 hours worth of a deck. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to spend 3 hours clearly, but it does mean that I've got more content here than I'm going to share today. And the reason for that is because I enjoy leave behind. And so I've got a lot of stuff in here that you all will probably, particularly if you're interested, want to spend a little bit of time with afterwards. But that might lead to questions, right? So ideally, you're reaching out to us either today, now, live, or generally, we'd love to talk to you more about UX. So, as I dive in. We do these webinars mostly monthly, and so this is representative of our December webinar, but we'd love to have you join us for future ones. We pick a range of topics. Typically, it's based on both what we're observing in the market, recent conversations. So I'll say this last thing as I kick off. If you have any requests for future webinars, please do reach out. I love talking to people one-on-one, but also I just as much love to take trends and patterns of need that we observe in the market and share it with more than just one person. So yeah, if you have any ideas for the future, we'd love to help you in both at work and in your career. So today's topic, I guess you could say is pitted against a certain thesis statement. I mean, certainly the idea that UX creates beautiful products is inherent to the topic today, but not just that. And so what we're going to talk about is a little bit about the history of UX, what it is. And as Chad articulated in the intro, it is more than just what you might think of. If you have this picture in your mind, UX is the group, the people, the function, the skill that makes a product look pretty. You would be partly right, but again, it is, I think, quite a bit bigger than that. And so today is to talk a little bit more about the other, maybe less obvious, maybe it is obvious, but less obvious aspects of UX that go all the way back to when it was first called user experience. And then we'll talk about the value of UX in the market and potentially in your product teams. This second bullet, this second kind of diamond, blue diamond that's on the slide right now, that will be helpful for people who maybe don't have UX, or maybe you do have what again you might call UX, but it's not doing all the things we're going to talk about today. And so orienting you further maybe to the identity and the definition of UX. Hopefully this gives you a better picture of the value. Thirdly, we'll talk about that UX role, and if we have time, I don't know that we'll have quite enough time to do this, but if we have time, we'll dig in, and not just to broad strokes what the role of UX is, and not just the role of UX in an organization, but also what a UXer does, but also how that relates to Agile. If we can have enough time, we may not, but if we have enough time, I'll spend a bit of time talking about how important UX is, not just to the way organizations design and implement product, but also to the very ubiquitous, most organizations, if I surveyed right now, are doing some form of Agile in their software development lifecycle. In my mind, if you're doing Agile without UX, you're missing something key. And so we'll talk about that when we get to that point. And then lastly, we'll talk a little bit, very briefly, about the future and where I've seen and where I've observed and also understood UX is going. It won't surprise very many of you because it's being impacted by lots of things that are impacting other things in the market, things like artificial intelligence. But we'll talk briefly about what the future of UX is. At a high level, let's talk about really quickly a survey. By the way, there's a lot of content on this slide. Actually, I haven't revealed it yet, but there will be a lot of content on this slide. I'm not going to talk about all the points, but just so you get a sense, UX has been going on a lot longer than computers. I would make the argument that whether it's feng shui, whether it's Greek's study of ergonomics, whether it's the Vitruvian, what's called the Vitruvian triad, right? Vitruvius, architect, into the BC era, going into AD, it was a Roman architect, arguably the very first architect, certainly that came up with systematic architecture for civil and construction engineering. Talked about the fact that structures needed three attributes. They needed beauty, which, as we've talked about, or they needed form, so to speak. They needed two other things. They needed usefulness, ironically very akin to usability in modern software engineering. And then it also needed foundation. So the durability of the structure also needed to be considered. So when you think about architecture, modern software architecture or modern software products even, I think a lot of the basis of what we do in UX even started back before we even started counting in AD. But it even goes back, right? UX has roots in a variety of engineering disciplines, as well as the earliest points when, for example, the Toyota performance management production system, TPS, when they started involving people on the production line to sort of pull what's called the Anden cord, which, I don't know if you're familiar with total quality management and TPS, but the idea is that in TPS, the Toyota system launched in the 40s, anybody along the manufacturing line, if they observe a problem in quality, can go pull the cord and say, hold on, stop the manufacturing line. We have now observed, and everybody was empowered to do that, right? So the notion that we're creating and designing systems with the user, the participant in mind, goes back into the early 40s and even to Taylorism during the turn of last century, as we were thinking about how does the worker work and how do we, now it's criticized, Taylorism is often criticized for being sort of everybody's a widget and they fit in a system, but honestly it was really the first time that people, behavioral psychologists, organizational psychologists looked at how the worker and the user impacts outcomes. And then going forward, we'll talk about Disney in a minute, but going forward, arguably one of the very first, and again, he wasn't called a user experience professional, right? But was Walt Disney. His vision for what he would do with Epcot was very similar to what we see in user research. And so, it has been, the argument has been made before that Walt Disney was the first UXer. And so we'll talk briefly about that in a minute. Now, as it enters computing, right? But in the 70s was when patterns became more relevant to the conversation. Another architect that has influenced this conversation is a guy named Christopher Alexander, who wrote a book. He wrote several books in the 70s and 80s that impacted the way we think about systems and their scale. And of course, his lens of systems was cities and buildings But the notion of a pattern library, for example, I don't know if you ever heard or thought about a pattern library in UI and UX, came into being through Christopher Alexander's work in cities and in civil engineering. Human factors engineering and the software crisis of the 70s came to be. So if you've not heard of what happened during the 70s and what's called kind of ubiquitously as the software crisis, this was when as computing became more complex, software became more complex. Well, the problem with that inherently, and what created this sort of crisis, was the way we thought about designing and implementing software needed to scale, but unfortunately people didn't know how to do that. So there was a string of cataclysmic software failures. Millions of dollars wasted in failed software during the 70s that ended up being known as the software crisis. And it's out of that software crisis that many other disciplines were born during the 80s. So things like HCI, human-computer interaction, usability and interaction design actually entered our vocabulary in the 80s. So how do we think about a user-centered orientation to designing software so that it's not just thinking about outcome, it's about thinking about the inputs to that outcome. Inputs meaning the people, the humans, the users. So now one of the things I'll say is this was also when, of course, the Mac was born, and so when personal computing started becoming increasingly popular, and when computers were in closets or in entire rooms and used by a very few number of people who were, by the way, highly trained and often mathematicians, HCI and usability interaction design were less of an issue. But when you started dropping computers in the schools in mass and in the homes of many, you had to ask the question: how do we design computers and software so that they're useful and usable and can take into account the overall experience of the end user? And so this is when the Mac came onto the scene. It's also when Donald Norman, whose name I will speak about a lot. He's actually credited with being the very first person to ever have user experience on his business card. It's when this is when he worked at Apple, but it's when he wrote his sort of seminal work, The Design of Everyday Things. And so he was a behavioral psychologist, and his study in how the design of objects in our world and eventually software has become to set the tone for and really become the backdrop for UX. And then, of course, into the modern age, this is the part of the story that, of course, everybody remembers, right? It's when the web hit. It's when Norman joined Apple and became, he updated, and we'll look at the quote that drove a lot of his thinking there in a minute. But it's when he came up with the first, he changed his title, I think, from from UI engineer to UX, to user experience architect. And so it's because of the reasons we'll talk about in a minute, but it's when, again, he was hired by Apple as a behavioral psychologist to help organizations, or cognitive psychologist, to help organizations, particularly Apple, think through how do we create more positive experiences across, not just from the time the person sits in front of the computer to use the software, but also before they sit down, while they're using the software, and also after they leave, right? The entire experience of the person with the brand, the marketing, the product, the packaging, the whole thing. So, and then this is also when, by the way, it's kind of ironic. There's a few sort of interesting, almost surprisingly coincidental years that happen, right? So in '95, that's when Scrum officially came into being. Now, Steve Krug wrote his seminal work, Don't Make Me Think, which was a book on user experience and usability in 2000, and a year after that was when the Agile Manifesto was written. So we'll talk a little bit about the relationship of all those things when we talk about the value of UX. But again, keep in mind, it is coincidental that these streams sort of entered our, consciousness, but also into the minds of the people building software at scale, all about the same time. So mid 90s to the early 2000s, and so that's certainly where we are today. So really quick, these two diagrams are actually helpful in that they show the overall scope of what user experience design actually is. They're mostly the same diagram, by the way. In fact, I think they're based on each other, but it really does go to show, if you look at this, like, for example, this bubble right here is all the things that are involved in being a user experience professional. I think most of the time people only think about this notion of the visual aspects. So, but again, being a user experience professional and doing user experience design involves all these disciplines. But let's make it a little simpler, right? So the idea is, and again, we talked about the fact that often Walt Disney, strange as it may seem, is often credited with maybe exercising UX in its earliest form. And this is this quote as he was introducing Epcot. Epcot is an experimental prototype that is always in the state of becoming a place where the latest technologies can be used to improve the lives of people. And again, it sounds a whole lot like user research that is done by a user experience professional. But then Donald Norman, again, he came up with the term that we use. Behavioral psychologist, wrote Design of Everyday Things in the 80s, and then joined Apple 10 years later. He said, I invented the term because I thought human interface and usability were too narrow. I wanted to cover all aspects of the person's experience with the system, including industrial design, graphics, the interface, physical interaction, and the manual, right? And the book that described it. Obviously, manuals now are probably online or in PDFs, but yeah, the whole point is the entire engagement with the product is what Donald Norman was trying to think through, and certainly that encapsulates, I believe, modern UX. So, here's a high-level definition. This actually comes from the Interaction Design Foundation. I tried to leave you guys with some further areas or sites you could go Google or look up. Interaction Design Foundation is a great source for a lot of sort of 101 material. Here's sort of a high level, and we'll look at this diagram a couple of times throughout this process. But yeah, the idea here is a user experience professional understands the context for use, helps to specify user requirements using a variety of tools, right? Designs the solutions, and then as they are built, evaluates those against the requirements. So it's this notion, it's this cycle of understanding what users really need. So the user experience design is the process design teams use to create products that provide meaningful and relevant experiences to users. This involves the design of the entire process of acquiring and integrating the product with the aspects of branding, design, usability, and function, right? So at a high level, it's a process. Its goal is to seek out the most meaningful and relevant experiences across the full spectrum of the product's use. I'll pause. I'll breathe for a minute. Does anybody have any thoughts about anything that I've shared so far, or questions? All right, good. Now, keep in mind, I tried to give you a slow roll, but we're going to speed up just a little bit. So, at a high level, just to bound what you guys help you guys bound what typical UXers think about, or what classically trained or experienced user experience organizations, functions, and people care about. I wanted to give you a few of the principles, right? Meet the actual user's needs. So not what you think users do, but what actually users do, and user testing helps get you there. Follow a process, right? This is the same diagram. It's like, oh, here it is again. Well, the reason I'm showing it again and again is because it's important to recognize that UX isn't a set of deliverables. UX is a process. And it's a process that helps us understand users better. I mean, that's really the goal. And so again, if you're doing UX and you don't have a UX process, then you should stop and decide what is in the scope for UX, and then also design the process to meet those goals. Right tools for the right time, right? There's a range, again, experientially, you guys probably have gotten pieces of this, everything from a sketch to a wireframe, to a high fidelity prototype, to an actual product design, at different times focusing on everything from the concept to the actual usability of the product. Clearly the wrong tool at the wrong time, wrong tool at the wrong time leads to the wrong outcome. So right tools for the right time. Usability testing. So it's important to understand what usability testing is, at least at a high level. Usability testing says, I'm gonna do some research, and I'm gonna figure out what I think what users care about. I'm gonna do that through interviews. I'm gonna do that through understanding industry. I'm gonna do that through by watching users work, and then I'm gonna design a solution, and then I'm gonna build a prototype to allow users to interact with that solution. And then what that will do, of course, is give me feedback that I can use to to understand what their experience of the product is. And of course, at that point, engineers go off and build a thing, and then there's another usability test opportunity. We'll call this the late usability test, when user acceptance testing and QA happens, and particularly QA facing the users. And consistency. It is one of the things that I think is very noticed, and yet, or let me say it this way, felt but often not noticed, is the extent to which your product is consistent. And so one of the things that, and again, this is a quote from Jacob Nielsen, Donald Norman, since having left Apple, has helped establish the Nielsen-Norman Group, one of the world's largest research and user experience organizations in the world. Jacob Nielsen, who is who has been donned at times, you'll see this in his little card below, King of Usability. He posits consistency is one of the most powerful usability principles. When things always behave the same, users don't have to worry about what will happen. So it's this notion that products, by way of being consistent, are more not just more usable, but also achieve better outcomes. So I'm going to pause one more time. Any questions? All right. Here's a few quick hit value points for UX. Why would you do UX in your organization at all? Well, this first one, there are a lot of great ROI investment and analysis studies. There's a study back in 2015 that was done phenomenal. It was a 2009 study. So if you want any of the details in these studies, feel free to email me. But yeah, here's just a few of the facts, right? Or a few of the points from those research items. $1 invested in UX brings $100 in return. Something like 44% increased retention due to UX. And this is across hundreds of products and product companies that have done what the analysts consider to be complete and good, mature usability. Another point of value for UX, right, is it clarifies what you're building. I don't know if you've ever managed, anybody on this call ever managed an engineering team. One of the great allergens to most engineers is ambiguity, right? It's really difficult to build what you don't understand. It's difficult to feel successful building a product that you didn't really have a clear understanding of the vision or the requirements. And so, of course, UX can help do that. It shifts the needle. I mean, part of what Donald Norman and really all the way going back in time, there's this thread of when you put when you put the user in the center of your design process, it achieves better outcomes. It allows users to get the product they need and not the product they ask for. I mean, this was a problem during that great software crisis of the 70s, right? People would specify requirements and all those requirements would be written down and the product would deliver exactly what they asked for, but not what they need. So a user-centered design process should right that ship. And then modern product development, it's difficult to do Agile, almost impossible, I would argue, without solid UX. It's difficult to do solid DevOps, I would argue. And again, when I say DevOps, I mean the process. I don't mean the tools or even the engineers who might bear that title. I mean the process. It's difficult to do good DevOps without solid UX. So to make that point, I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about Agile because I think it's really important to understand the critical role that UX plays in any Agile organization. So if you've gone through an Agile transformation, if you're deploying Scrum, or if you have it and you're operating at high speed, if you don't have UX, I think you're missing something key, or if you've not deployed UX. So if you're not familiar with Agile what it means, just really quick, just so I can share the alignments right. Agile values individuals and interactions, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration. Again, think about that as another spin on user-centered. And then lastly, responding to change or following a plan. So if you think about Agile, you should almost immediately think about user-centered because again, that's largely what Agile, the Agile Manifesto was meant to create. I won't give all the background. You'll notice my subtitle when nerds got together and talk about a more user-centered engineering process. I mean, that's effectively what happened in 2001 when the Agile Manifesto was written. The goal was to say to engineering teams, how do we start to deliver software that is exactly what the user needs and not just what they said they wanted. And so there's great alignment, right? And so just a few statistics. Again, this is mostly for leave behind, but if you compare product quality, stakeholder value, ROI, time schedule, I mean, Agile produces better software, period. Versus, again, if you're familiar with the term waterfall, it's basically the opposite of Agile. It's what they did during the great software crisis of the 70s. It's certainly what organizations did in the early, mid, and late 80s, going into the early, mid, and late 90s. Of course, there's lots of organizations that still deploy waterfall. You might be in one of them, but certainly Agile produces better outcomes. Again, I'm leaving these statistics behind in the deck, so please feel free to reach out if you need any more information there. But here's the point. If you want to have a user-centered process, if you want design helping you identify who your people are, who the personas are that you're serving, your users, their motivations, their drivers, their needs, their language, their context, again, all the things that UX does, and Agile is going to do all the thing it does, right? Create scale in engineering teams, hopefully produce stable and predictable outcomes, implement interfaces, user and data, as well as model and implement store data itself. Provide access for, if you want that process, both, by the way, Agile and UX, try to make the user the center of that model. You need both to reinforce each other. Again, this slide sort of gives that at a high level, right? UX provides requirements to Agile and Agile provides feedback to UX. And so this is where these things are mutually reinforcing. So building on that, right? I mean, again, I want this to be a strong leave behind for you guys. So I inventoried, in most part, the UX process tries to capture the user, this king user over here, queen, I guess it's a queen user, unless it's a king with long hair, I suppose. Their desires, right? What are their requirements? And they do this by doing research, building personas, building wireframes, building prototypes, designing language, be that visual language or actually vocabulary and terms and a control vocabulary, designing visuals, documenting narratives, and potentially, in the context of Agile, helping to define epics and stories. But a key part of Agile providing value to UX, which means, again, there's a give and get, there's a mutually reinforcing idea. In order for UX to do well, it needs feedback. It can do this by through team collaboration, by perspective from both the Agile team itself as well as early user testing on the complexity of the software. Also, sometimes, I'm sure you've never been a part of this, right? A UX designer will design software that meets the user's need, but is really difficult to build, right? So you get feedback from the Agile team. Hey, you've designed this and it's lovely and I think it'll meet the user's need, but that's going to take me 1 billion hours to build this thing. So the notion of technical complexity also is an opportunity for feedback. So dev feasibility complexity, user acceptance testing. We talked about that a little bit ago when I saw those white bubbles on that red background, right? User research is informed by user testing. It happens really at 2 key points during prototyping and also during late stage user acceptance testing. There is also the notion of non-functional requirements, which can impact design. You know, again, as I talked about, there's feasibility, but then there's also a notion of what you just designed won't scale. Technically, it won't scale. And so the non-functional requirements is also feedback that a UX professional needs to do their job. Requests that come in, right? I mean, sometimes you get sometimes the UX professional gets feedback early in the process through discussions. Sometimes it doesn't come until late, right? I mean, lots of tickets come in for this particular feature. Why? Well, maybe there's bugs, but also maybe because it's not clear. And so the ability, and then also, as I said, issue bugs. And then also, if you've been a part of an Agile process, you know, inherent to most of them, Scrum being one, that is a good example of this. Typically, retrospectives are built in. So at the end of every period, whether that's a sprint, whether that's a Kanban frame, whatever it is, the ability to be able to give feedback, not just to the engineering team and not just have them give feedback to each other or to the Scrum Master or the product owner, but also the UXer and help them get that feedback. I provided these 2 examples. I think it's important to recognize, and this is my opinion, but my opinion is, which is, I'm going to share my opinion for what it's worth, is that this is a healthy, it's not the only model, right? But it's a healthy Scrum product team where notice UX designer is embedded in the product team. Right alongside of the product owner, right alongside of the back-end engineer and front-end engineer and the DevOps people. This is the most integrated lens. And so if you're not including your UX designers in your Agile process, or if you don't have them included in your Agile process, then I would argue this is where you need to be to achieve all the value that we just talked about. Now, you might say to me, wait a minute, we've got this, but we just have a business analyst in that role. Well, here's the thing. Business analysts, of which there might be on this call, so P.S. I don't mean to suggest that you're not needed in the world. You're definitely needed in the world. But I think your role has changed over time. And I think as UX professionals' role has changed over time and matured, I think there's an opportunity to go through a little bit of a decision tree. You know, this slide is a little sensational. Is the business analyst role dead? Well, no, I don't believe so. But I do think that one of the ways, and I've said this to many organizations, even to our own, actually, even to Provisions Group, we've talked about this, but it's this idea that in a lot of contexts where you would have traditionally said, we really need a business analyst for that. The right answer was that you need somebody doing that, but it actually probably wasn't a business analyst. It's actually a UXer. And there's a number of reasons why, and we can talk about that if we have time. But ultimately, I'll say I've tried to leave behind a little bit of a decision tree. And so I'm not going to go through that right now, but the idea is there are really 3 paths. One path is you need to use a UX designer instead of a business analyst. Because again, I think you're going to get a better outcome by leveraging the skills of that UX designer. In some cases, if you don't have a UX designer, this is a little bit funny and meant to be sarcastic, but it's actually true. If you don't have a UX designer, you still need a UX designer. So whether that's hiring a part-time one through a firm like ours, or whether that's actually going out and finding, getting one sourced, and hiring them full-time, that's I think there's a certain flow here that suggests that if the system has a UI, if it's a non-technical user base and you don't have UX in your org, you need to hire somebody. And then lastly, I do think there is a path that leads to the business analyst being the logical outcome. So, all right, this is my last section here. I'll pause at the end for questions or comments, but let's get through the futures. So UX as a discipline, where's it going? And I think, and again, there are probably more trends. We can talk about these more at the end. I think there are a number of things going on in the broader technical landscape, but also in human factors and the way humans engage in computing that impact these trends. Number one, I said it earlier, is kind of in my preamble, AI. AI is impacting UX in lots of ways. One is, not the way to become more user-centered is to leverage artificial intelligence, because clearly that's not a user, that's a computer. At the same time, we understand user behavior better now than we ever have, and we have tools, to collect intelligence about user behavior more thoroughly than we ever have. And so I think one of the things I think you will continue to see in a variety of disciplines in IT, and certainly UX is one of them, is the ability to take information from the ways in which users are actually using the product and make inferences about how the user patterns of use, black holes, meaning this user tried to do X, Y, Z and couldn't. And so here's a chance to sort of predict a negative user experience. And so you're going to see this more and more as AI makes it more and more into the mainstream. Obviously, we know it's making it into the mainstream more and more each day, with cloud providers providing more and more AI as a service. But yeah, I think you will, and obviously AI being built therefore into a lot of products that would support, for example, the UX professional. And so, gaining insight on the use of applications, detecting issues early, also designing for users experiencing AI. So this is a different bend on this point, but of course, users not only can provide intelligence that can feed AI models and machine learning, but also, users are now using AI more, whether that's speech to text analytics, whether that's predictive in general, whether that's alerts that encourage certain behavior, right? I mean, it's like if you've ever downloaded and installed a game on your iPhone, it's like the nudges that get put into place are often based on predictions, and so users experiencing AI I think will continue to drive trends in UX. There's a number of products on the market now that have empowered this new wave of development. I think most of you on this call have probably heard of the low code, no code movement and the citizen developer of the world, but there's potentially, I don't know that it's going to be quite as bad as what the 70s suggested, but as the complexity, as the empowerment gets higher and higher, so for non-developers to build things, right? I mean, so if you think about any piece of software that provides drag and drop and configurability and basically custom solution development without code, or with very little code, you've got these platforms now that are empowering masses to build stuff. Well, that is going to lead to some extent the same kind of thing that happened during the software crisis of the 70s, where as those tools get more and more capable, you're going to end up with more and more of a need to manage the complexity of the scale of that capability. And so again, in my mind, UX professionals will be drawn more and more into low-code, no-code tools to help developers manage, again, non-coding citizen developers to manage that complexity. We talked about this earlier in artificial intelligence, but voice, gestures, augmented reality, these are all often powered by AI. It says IA, it's meant to say AI, but those are all powered by AI. But they're a new UX paradigm, right? I mean, back in the days when Xerox PARC launched the Alto and gave us the graphical user interface and the mouse, right? Voice and gestures and augmented reality often don't use the mouse, right? And they may not use any traditional user experience paradigm. And so designing for those, I'll call them UIs in a broad sense of the word, experiences. I mean, designing for those experiences is going to represent not just a new set of skills for UXers, but also new UX design tools. And then lastly, this is a trend that I think is going to impact the way we design and implement products, and also the role that UXers play in that world, which has to do with what's called healthy UX. You're starting to see this trend, and of course, the tech industry, social media has gotten a really bad reputation, earned a really bad reputation for addiction drivers and causing people to really care more about time in app versus quality time in app. How much time you spend in my app may or may not support your long-term use of the app. You may burn out on my app. You may use my app. I may have nudged you. I may have brought you in, but eventually I basically delete your app. Not because I didn't like it, not because it wasn't a good experience, but because it wasn't creating a healthy outcome for me. I wasn't, it wasn't good for my brain. And, I think people are becoming more and more aware of the impact, social and cognitive impact of high engagement technologies. That I think UX, I mean, this is a common trend and a common discussion. UX will have to incorporate not just simply how do we create engaged users, but how do we create engaged users that are engaged just enough and just in the right way to, promote wellness or at least not cross the line into unhealthy usage patterns. And so that people can't just accomplish the goals that they're wanting to accomplish, both the product organizations and the users themselves, but also that users feel empowered and supported by the experiences we deliver to them. So that's the talk today, guys. UX, in my mind, is one of the most important roles in any organization because it moves from presumed realities to knowledge based on user research about what your users actually need, and then has the skills and tooling to be able to get those insights into the hands of the people who build, and then again provides a feedback loop so that better user research and better outcomes happen. So, and I would say this as I close, often if you're thinking, I need somebody to help me capture requirements, and perhaps especially if you're leveraging agile project management, the right decision may not be to go out and find, hire, source, align a business analyst. It might be the right decision to say, how do I want my users to interact with the product from end to end, and how do I want to capture requirements in the forms of artifacts that are helpful, not just for developers to know what they're building, but also for users to provide as early feedback in that process as possible. You might need a UXer. So anyway, thank you guys. What questions do you have? Do you have any questions for me or for anybody on the provisions group side, or any comments? By the way, again, nobody's interjected. I invited interruptions, but nobody interrupted me. But yeah, do you have any comments for the community or for the provisions group team?
Hey guys, this is Brian. I've got a couple thoughts. Big fan of what you put together here. Totally agree on all points. I was thinking about the get the product need and not what you asked for. Sort of point you were making earlier.
Yeah.
And it occurs to me that this whole process of UI UX is sort of a process of discovery along with the client and along with the architects. Sort of a project glue in a sense. And I think one of the mistakes that sort of junior level UI UXers can make is this sort of like rigid mindset of I'm the expert and you need to listen to me. I'm going to tell you how this needs to be built. I think sort of that curious mindset is one of your best tools as a UXer.
No, I think that's right, and I think the natural tendency to and again, to interject not only the belief that I know something that I maybe don't know quite as thoroughly as I thought, but also bias, right? Like and I don't mean bias like in a self-serving outcome perspective. We just all have our own perspective, right? We all have our own background and points of interest, and so one of the things that, of course, user research seeks to do is to drive out or eliminate or minimize the bias of your background as a designer, as a product strategist, and potentially product organization leader or product owner, as well as an engineer. I mean, part of what also happens clearly when you don't have good UX in place is engineers are often left to make their own assumptions, and that I don't have to tell you, I don't have to explain. Clearly, that's the case. That's not a good idea because not just because the engineer does or doesn't know what the users might need. It's that the engineer is just one user and one person who has a particular set of perspectives, may be valid, but certainly won't necessarily be representative of the users that might use the product unless you're actually doing good user research based UX design. So that's good, Brian. I appreciate that. What else, man, guys? Anything else? Whether that's questions or comments for the community?
I have a quick question that could go to you, Eric, or Brian. So from a front-end development aspect, how could we really help ask the right questions for the UX designers, or how can we better kind of work together and just kind of get the right product that really gets people involved and the users involved with the app?
Yeah, it's interesting because it's fun to me. It's a good question. It's fun to me that the very first person to use UX it was not a technologist at all. So it's like the very, Donald Norman specifically, he was a behavioral and cognitive psychologist. And so the idea that I think people who do this really well, and some people who do it really well intuitively, like we have several people on our team that I just sit in a room with and I'm just sort of in awe with the way they approach this process, because it doesn't start with the questions that I would think of. It doesn't start with what screens do you want and what fields do you want on that screen and what data do you want stored in your database. It's very outcome. What are you trying to driver and motivation oriented? And that's not where you stop, right? I mean, you have to map those things to specific software outcomes. So to answer the question, I think one of the things we almost have to sort of push pause and slow down, especially as engineers and architects and, again, technical people. I think part of we're sort of jump over this first bit, again, probably because we assume we have it all square in our brain. But again, just slowing down and sort of asking a more fundamental set of, what are you actually trying to accomplish? Or, if you could do, I think I've heard Brian, for example, mention, if you could, what are the top 3 things that if you could just do them better or more quickly would revolutionize the way that you, not just the way that you operate, not just Taylorism, right? Not just more productive, but would actually make your life better, like would actually make you have a better experience in the world. And so I think one of the ways to think about your questions is to go like slow down and let's not talk about the product for just a minute. Let's talk about what you do, what you care about, what are your needs. And then once we feel like we understand that and we've documented those things, then we can move on to more specific technical questions. But yeah, I hope that answers the question. But I think slowing down and focusing on the fact that you're sitting across from a breathing human, and not just a quote unquote guy who's interacting with a keyboard, is helpful, because you can kind of get at the drivers and the motivations of what that user needs. Other questions? I think we might be. Well, I guess we're not close to time. I was actually watching two
Eric,
timers.
this is Dave. I have one
Hey, Dave.
question.
Yeah.
You brought up some really good points regarding the UX designer and a BA, obviously. And in the past, we mainly used a UX designer for customer facing from a UI standpoint. External, web apps and stuff. But you really brought up some, as I said, excellent points and gave a lot of people something to think about. Do you see the BA role evolving into UX designer? Because it seems like there's a skill set that's needed on both. And it just seems that maybe like a more supercharged BA is a UX. I don't know. Do you see one evolving into the other?
So that's a super question. So let's talk about really quickly. One of the reasons I took the tact that I did, some of it's experiential, but some of this is just like figuring out how to communicate what I've seen at a high level. And so one of the reasons why I interjected this little middle of this deck to talk about Agile is because most of what I said is really, really true in Agile organizations. And so in organizations that are still, for any number of reasons, some of which are sort of valid, I mean, there are contexts when the traditional waterfall project makes sense. And so in those cases where you do need to try to document as many of the very low level requirements as you possibly can, I do think those are organizations that need both. Because you do need a person thinking about the way the user is going to engage in the system, and then you almost have to have them, because it's not Agile, it's not incremental. You're trying to get all the requirements all at once. You need somebody to almost play a bridge role between like the UXer who just sort of documented all the human touch pieces, and then somebody who's going to take that 1 or 5 steps deeper and talk about the way that's going to reflect in all the data, and the way it's going to reflect in all the fields, and the way it's going to reflect in all the screen flows. And some of that a UXer will do, but some of that ends up being a nice, I'll call it a handoff point or a collaboration point between a traditional BA and a traditional UXer. But in the context of Agile, I do think I do think it would be smart. Let me say it this way. I don't know that I've seen this a lot because typically UXers do come yeah, I mean, I would say 9 times out of 10, UXers do come from a very different background than most BAs. And so, and BAs typically have their heyday or are most successful and most needed in traditional organizations that are not doing Agile. And so your BAs living in an Agile organization, I think, yeah, could see if they could acquire various skills that are UX skills. I do think part of what's interesting is the tool sets for UXers honor the fact that a lot of UXers have this design component to their role, and so a lot of the tools that are built for user experience professionals were built with kind of a design acumen that most BAs don't have. But yeah, I think I mean, as far as what I'm seeing, yeah, it doesn't happen a lot because honestly, they tend to be such different skilled and backgrounded people. But yeah, I think if you're a senior BA and you've been doing BA work, or maybe even a junior BA, and you're trying to figure out your career path, I would say, yeah, picking up skills, picking up Envision skills, picking up XD or Sketch skills. Not that you're going to be necessarily the guy making things look beautiful all the time, but these are skills that candidly would help you capture user requirements in a way that's more compatible with getting user feedback. You know, part as you know, I mean, the tired axiom or whatever is pictures are worth 1,000 words, right? So, you know, one of the inherent, I'd say, gotchas with traditional business analysis is BAs. You know, they document very thoroughly, typically requirements in words. And then what happens is those words get reviewed by customers who sign off on those words. Well, the problem with that is frequently the words, you know, the picture that I have in my brain when I read those words might not be the same picture that the person who implements those words actually has. And so part of why UX is helpful is because it takes a step back from the words a minute and says, let's look at this thing visually and see what we're actually building, and then let the words sort of fall out from that. So yeah, in my opinion, any BA who's doing BA work, particularly in Agile teams, yeah, if you don't have access to a UX person, then yeah, you at least want to probably get familiar with what wireframing is and how to talk about user flows in the context of wireframes and describe, you know, outcomes and personas and these sorts of things. Because again, yeah, I mean, these are very different backgrounded people often, but I do think those skills, there's going to be I don't know if it's a mass convergence or not. I doubt it's going to be this thing where the BA and the UXer becomes the same career path. But I do think there's an opportunity for one, and candidly, sometimes the other. I will say some of our more creative UXers are not as analytically thorough as what a BA, a really skilled BA. So I actually think there's probably skills, tools, techniques for both sides to borrow from the other. But I would say in an organization doing Agile, yeah, you're going to want whoever is doing your requirements design and documentation needs to be either hooked at the hip with or needs to be a UXer. So I don't know if that helps answer the question, David.
Yeah, it did. It did. Great. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Other questions or thoughts, guys? This is good.
Just a quick thought that sometimes because of the well thought through documentation and understanding of requirements up front also helps enable on the QA side of things, especially if you're a lean organization or a lean team, you might sometimes have some transferable skills that they could sit on the QA team along with them because they thoroughly understand those requirements up front.
No, you're right. And actually it was inherent in this diagram right here, but like this notion that user research is informed by testing, and the notion that you test both at prototype. I mean, usually this, I'm going to draw, see if I can do this. I actually don't do this often, so we'll see if I can do this. Pin. Yeah, these three bubbles typically happen, often, we'll say often happen outside of the Scrum team. Like there might be a little bit of this overlap. You know, I'll draw these bubbles as though they overlap, right? But like, you know, this right side set of three bubbles often happens in the product organization outside of the Scrum team, so outside of the Agile team. But then you've got this other usability test right here that happens usually as a part of the release management process and a part of Scrum and a part of Agile and a part of iterative. And so the UX person, product organization, candidly, gets feedback and intel during user acceptance testing. And so there is, to your point, there is this integration that happens full cycle, like early and late, all with UXers. So that's where this diagram, candidly, way down here, let me see if I can get there quickly. This is where this organizational model of having a Scrum team designed with the UXer in, well, shoot, it was way farther. I should have punched the key. Hold on, got too many transitions. Yeah, that's where this having this UXer embedded in the Scrum team from the get-go. So this is a product Scrum team where I'm talking about all the rituals, right? Sprint planning and daily Scrum and backlog grooming and and as we talked about earlier, retrospectives. I mean, I think having a UX designer in it the whole time is critical, really critical to the success of the thing. So, that's great, Troy. I appreciate that. Any other thoughts today? We are coming up on time. We got about 4 more minutes until top of the hour. Does anybody else have any comments or questions? I appreciate the time today, guys. It's been a good session.
Just amusing. You were talking about AI technology. I often think about how the software that the UI UXer uses to create wireframes and prototypes will be affected by AI software, not just the products they create. And I sort of think the evolution with low code, no code is going to see something similar. From the creative side. Yeah, when it becomes more.
I agree. Part of what I'm really looking forward to, it hasn't hit us yet, is the predictive nudges to a low code, no code designer. So if you think about a low code, no code designer designing, an app or a form or an automation or a flow, and some sort of nudge that enters their lens that says, I wouldn't do it that way, or here's the way I'd recommend you do that based on other product processes or screens we've seen with high engagement. So no, I 100% agree with you that the citizen developer will be impacted by that. But again, in a similar fashion, I think I would argue the user experience professional. I think you guys saw an email from me on the provisions group side. There's a new product that Amazon has launched. Not that this has been a particularly good day for Amazon on the East Coast, but Amazon has launched a new product that has got integration with Figma. So if you're familiar with Figma, the UX UI kind of design tool, it has direct integration with Figma so that you can wireframe mock-up screens and then hit a button effectively and have those forward engineer this low code, no code solution in Amazon. So like the ability for your designs to effectively become not just a prototype, not just sort of an Envision style, mock-up, but a literal running and deployed app. And so that I think we'll continue to see more of that integration between UX tooling and low code, no code tooling. But yeah, to your point, Brian, the feedback of AI to all of that, I think will continue to kind of astound us. And yeah, hopefully give us better intelligence on users, because part of course, any research process is only bounded by what it knows and what it asks. And so the neat part about AI is it's going to give us even better research, answer questions that we didn't even know we needed to ask. So no, I think that's right. That's right. All right, guys, we're at 3 o'clock. Thank you so much for the time. I'll hand things back off to Chad to sort of wrap us up.
Actually, Chad had to jump off, but I'm going to wrap us up. But I just appreciate everybody joining on the call today. So it was very helpful, and appreciate you guys being here. If you have any questions or follow-up, certainly reach out to any of us at the Provision Group team, and we'll be happy to help you. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thanks, everybody.